Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are going to wait a couple more minutes to let people log in, and then we can start. Well, I think we're ready to go. Thank you so much for joining today. We are going to be talking about the recently launched flight guidance from the SBTi. And in today's webinar, our experts are Sander, Dale, and Arnaud, both specialists in FLAG. Sander will introduce himself during his presentation, and as well as Arnaud. So before diving into our today's topic, I wanted to give you some housekeeping rules. So all participants are muted by default. So if you have a question, please use this chat function, drop them in the chat, and we will keep an eye on it. And then at the end of the presentation, we will reserve some minutes to go through your questions. The slides and the recording of the session are going to be shared with all participants after today's session. So before just talking about SBTi and FLAG, would also like to give you an introduction of who EcoAct is, what do we do, and why are we talking about FLAG today. So going back a little bit to the agenda, we're going to be focusing on SBTi and the recently FLAG guidance launch, what is included, but also what about removals and how do companies can set a target, and then followed by a Q&A session at the end. So in EcoAct, an evident business, we are an end-to-end service provider, an international climate consultancy, but also project developer with representation Montreal, Munich, Milan, and Amber County. We are a global CDP accredited partner for science. We have supported over 50 science-based targets with 100% approval rate, a 7-time award winner from Environmental Finance Awards, including Best Carbon Offset Project Developer. And we have supported companies to doing offsetting with us in 2022, 135 clients. And we have also supported 413 carbon offsetting projects across 56 countries since 2006. So before entering into the main topic, I think it's important to put things into perspective. And it's also vital to revisit the concept of science-based targets and the mission of the Science-Based Target Initiative. So science-based targets, as the name implies, are emission reduction objectives that are guided by the latest climate science. These targets align with the goals of the Paris Agreement to limit global temperature increase to below 1.5 degrees. The Science-Based Target Initiative, or SBTi, as commonly known, is a collaborative effort between CDP, the United Nations Global Compact, the WRI, and the WWF, and they're pivotal in empowering businesses to set emission reduction. By providing a clear pathway to emission reduction, businesses can not only contribute to global decarbonization efforts, but also companies can achieve significant business benefits. These include cost savings, increased regulatory resilience, boosted investor confidence, enhanced innovation and competitiveness, and also have the chance to demonstrate genuine sustainability commitments to an increasingly demanding consumer. Time is to accelerate companies worldwide to support halving global emissions before 2030 and achieving net zero before 2050. And they do this by promoting best practice in target set adoption. Now, one of those guidance that we're talking about today is the SBTi Forest Land and Agriculture Guidance, known as FLAG, which is also the world's first standard method for companies in land-intensive sectors to set science-based targets that include land-based emission reduction and removals, and it's applicable to specific sectors related to, for example, agri-food, textile and fashion, pulp and paper, among others. So we will delve deeper into this, into the topic in the following slides. Now, on that note, over to you, Arnaud.
Thank you, Mireille, and thank you everyone for coming here today. So just to present me in a few words, so I'm Arnaud Ripoll, a senior consultant in our research and innovation team in EcoAct, and I specialize in the decarbonation of the agri-food sector, and therefore in the specific subject of FLAG. So in this section, I'm going to speak of what is FLAG and what specifically are we included in what we call FLAG when we are doing carbon footprinting for companies. So first, let's speak of the main documents that we are speaking of, because we are basing all our presentation on two main documents that have been released last year. So the first one is a guidance that helps you calculate FLAG emissions and also removals. We are coming back on this later. It's the GHG Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance, so released last year. And the second one is a guidance that helps you set the FLAG decarbonation targets. So with the first one, you can calculate emissions. The second one, you can set a target. So basically, these two are totally complementary. So when these guidance have been released, let's do a little history on that. So last year in January, the SBTi released the draft guidance, and in June, an FAQ document especially on this topic. And then in September, we have the main releases that have been made. So the first one is the final guidance, V1 of the SBTi FLAG, and the second one is the draft guidance of the GHG Protocol Land Sector and Removals. And what are we expecting now? So we should expect this year, it has to become firm now, either in Q2 or Q3, the FLAG guidance V2, mainly to address demand-side companies. And the second document that we are waiting for is the final guidance of the GHG Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance that we expect mainly mid 2024. So what type of companies needs to set FLAG targets? FLAG targets is mandatory for some sectors, and it could be relevant for others. So first thing to look at is the companies where you can call as main FLAG sectors. Those are companies that must set FLAG targets if they are engaged in the SBTi initiative. So it's basically all companies that are linked to food in any way. So food production, processing, retailing, any companies linked to forest also, and tobacco. All these companies must set FLAG targets. And we have another pool of a lot of other sectors where you may have to set FLAG targets, but for this you have to make an assessment, a carbon footprint of FLAG emissions. And if your FLAG emissions represent more than 20% of your total scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, you will have to set FLAG targets. And if it's below, you can set FLAG target if you want, but it's not mandatory. So the main sectors concerned here could be, for example, textile, which is quite a big one. Anything linked to mining, mainly restaurants also could be included in these sectors. The second question that you may have is, what is the deadline? If you are already engaged in the SBTi or not, you have two main deadlines to submit your SBTi FLAG targets. So the first one is if you already have validated SBTi, so you need to submit a FLAG target based on what I've said in the previous slide. You must do your FLAG target submission within 6 months after the release of the final version of the GHG Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance. As said before, that is expected mid-2024, so mid-next year. And if you are setting your first SBT target, or if you are updating an existing target that you have, you must set flag targets upon resubmission. You can use for that the draft guidance of the GHG protocol. So if it's before the release of the final version.
And just a quick confirmation, FLAG stands for Forest, Land and Agriculture. So that is what FLAG stands for. Over to you again, Arno.
Yeah, and we are going to see what is included in this FLAG term. So when we speak of FLAG, we are speaking of part of a GHG inventory. So you have your total GHG inventory, okay, your carbon footprint, you can say like this way. And the main target of a FLAG GHG inventory will be to divide your total GHG inventory in two parts, a part called FLAG and a part called non-FLAG. The FLAG plus non-FLAG equals to your total GHG inventory. The new thing here, so you basically have two inventories. The new thing here is that you will have to set new targets on specifically the boundary of FLAG emissions only. So these are the new targets to develop. If you already have SBT targets, you already have a non-FLAG target. What will change is the boundary of the emissions. So you will only have non-FLAG emissions that will be covered by your previous targets that has been previously submitted. And if you don't have targets, you have to set a non-FLAG and a FLAG target in the same time. Of course, if you are one of the companies that are required to set a FLAG target. So what is included then, if we deep dive into the FLAG GHG inventory, what can we found in this GHG inventory? So you'll find four main categories. The three main one are all the what we call FLAG emissions. So in this category, you will include three main categories, subcategories, let's say this way. So the first one is all emissions linked to land use change. Land use change is basically quite simple. It's just the change of one land use to another one. So if you have a forest, you deforest it, and then you have a crop, it's basically land use change. This entails emissions. This is called deforestation, and these emissions have to be included in this box. You also, when you manage your land, you also have emissions. It could be CO2, CH4, and N2O emissions mainly. So in this, you have two subcategories. So all emissions linked to CO2. So for example, if you do tillage of your soil, for the agricultural example, you will have CO2 emissions. And if you have, for example, if you use fertilizer, which is quite common, you will have fertilizer use related emissions. And if you have cows, for example, we will have enteric fermentation, CH4 emissions linked to enteric fermentation of cows. In the last box, you have all removals that you can include in your FLAG targets. And for example, if you do agroforestry practices, if you do meadows, if you do any practices that helps you stocks carbon in the soil or in the biomass, you can include that in your target and use them as reduction. We are going to speak that also later. So, and at the end, what is included in the non-FLAG part? Basically all other emissions of your carbon footprint. So for example, diesel use, any petrol use, etc. Mainly the use of fossil fuel, basically. You also have, for example, here, refrigerant gas leaks, cement production, etc. All the other emissions will be in your non-FLAG part. And if I put more example of what is included in FLAG, we can show you this graph. So here you can see different type of sources of emissions that are called FLAG. So you can see on the left part a lot of emissions that are that we call biogenic because they are linked to biological processes. So just one example, the enteric fermentation emissions of cows that entail CH4 emissions are included in this section. And as you can see in your FLAG GHG inventory, you can also include anthropogenic emissions that are basically linked to your farm in some way, or in your production of raw material in some way. So the main one is fertilizer production for the most of the crops. It could be quite important also to include machinery energy consumption, of course, of any tractors, any machine that you have, any equipment that consumes energy, electricity, diesel, etc. and the transport of biomass, which is quite a sub-step of the second one. So at the end, in your flag inventory, you will have mainly biogenic emissions, but also a few anthropogenic emissions. At some point, to simplify it a bit, flag emissions will be any emissions that stop at the farm, so at the farm gate. So all emissions before up to the farm gate can be included in a flag in GHG inventory if we simplify it a bit.
And just one more comment on that. I can see some questions coming in, so please keep them coming. When we're looking at this, the anthropogenic side, the reason why the SBTi have included and allowed some of those anthropogenic emissions to be included is largely due to how the emission factor databases are at the moment. This is a developing space. We are still working through that. So a lot of emission factors when looking at products, depending on where you are in a value chain and how close you are to the field, they include those anthropogenic emissions within it, and it's very difficult to split them out. So that's just a comment on why on the previous slide, the aim is to have those over in the non-flag side, but actually pragmatically for the moment, we have to include some in certain cases if the data is not fully available.
And to relate to just another question, for example, land use change related to mining can be included in flag. In fact, any type of land use change can be included in flag, because like this category is for any type of land use change. So deforestation, peatland drainage, any forest to crop type of change of use of land use.
And I think we'll run through the questions in more detail at the end. So thank you very much, Arnaud. If I'm going to head over to my section, which I'm going to build on what Arnaud said. So hi, I'm Zander. I'm a senior consultant here at EcoAct. I specialize in FLAG. I've got a background in forestry and biodiversity, as well as kind of adapting kind of pre-feasibility studies, which is essentially the first stage of project development, which comes in handy when we're talking about removals. So what are removals? We've heard about emissions. Emissions are those being emitted from actions, either through land use change, through activities that are happening on the land. Removals are an increase in net land carbon stock. So that is the storage of CO2 down, whether we're talking in soil, whether we're talking about in above ground biomass, litter, deadwood, that sort of thing. So it is essentially the long-term storage of those emissions. And we'll go into a couple of different examples shortly in a second. And so defined by the GHG protocol, land sector removals guidance, and then also included within the FLAG guidance, here are some of the rules that we have for removals. So this is the first time removals have been allowed within a target, within an SBTi target. So they must be reported separately from emissions. So you can't, they have to be a separate line in your inventory. So once you've done that, you can subtract the removals from your emissions, essentially netting them out, and you can have a net emissions line underneath it. So you would have your emissions, your removals, and your net emissions overall. The other big important one is that the removals cannot be used for your non-flag target. So any flag removals and any removals can only be accounted against your flag emissions. So if we go back to the kind of previous page, we're talking about the enteric emissions from cows, for example, and all of those ones, the removals that you will be getting from crops could be used against that, but not against the wider kind of non-flag emissions that you would have within your wider inventory. And they need to follow the GHG protocol removals requirements. So what that means is that it's a lot more difficult to account for removals within your inventory. They make it, rather than kind of calculating your emissions where there can be some assumptions made, removals, because you are kind of negating those emissions, they require a very similar methodology to those accounted for within offsetting projects. And so kind of, in the future dubbed insetting in this way. So those requirements, that means that we are looking at ongoing storage monitoring. So you need to be monitoring that going forward. It needs to be traceable. So throughout the full pathway, you need to be accountable, and it needs to be traceable. Where is it happening? What location? And actual data from those sites. Oh, excuse me. Skip forward there. So traceable, that's a really big part of it. Primary data. So if you are going to account for removals, you need to be getting actual data from the site. And we'll dive into that a bit more in a little bit. You also need to account for the uncertainty. How sure are you that this has actually happened? And if there is a reversal, so you're calculating your removals in 2023, in 2024, you see that wood that you've grown has burnt down. You need to account for those emissions from that wood burning within your inventory. So it's going up and down over time, hopefully increasing as we move forward. So there are some quite stringent checks on that. That need to be accounted for when looking at removals. And when we look at the types of removals, so we'll dive into it on the next slide, but you are only allowed to account for removals on land owned or operated by the company. So it can't be like an offsetting project somewhere outside your value chain. This has to be accounted for within your value chain. Removals within your supply chain are also included. So whether you own the land or whether it's within the value chain, that can be included. The things which are not allowed is carbon storage in products. So you'll see that there are a lot of companies looking at storing carbon within plastic bottles, for example. That is not allowed at the moment. You are also not allowed to account for carbon credits because they are outside of your value chain, so they cannot be included. And the use of direct air capture or other technological removals, we are only looking at biogenic removals in this manner. And with there is a lot of buzz around this. The GHG protocol is kind of taking us through that, but there's a lot of wider guidance from the offsetting space. So Verra and Gold Standard are both kind of developing methodologies looking at Scope 3 emissions. And there are wider institutes for insetting as well who are also kind of looking to develop this. So the four kind of key areas that the GHG protocol looks at for removals is forest restoration on working lands, improved forest management, agroforestry, and enhancing soil organic carbon. I appreciate that there are more ways of removing carbon going forward, but if you had working land such as a farm and you started planting trees around it, then that could be accounted for. Improving the forest management. So if you're kind of taking a degrading woodland and actually improving that going forward, then and kind of managing that better, that can be accounted for. And agroforestry, working with trees and animals or crops, very important and another key one. And then soil organic carbon, I think, is a big buzz at the moment. There is a lot of focus on that. We need to be engaging in regenerative farming. So that's going to be a very large one for a lot of the food kind of companies who are going to be setting FLAG targets. They are going to need to be engaging with these types of projects. Perfect. Okay, so if we kind of head into the data requirements of what we're talking about here with emissions, so whether you're calculating your scope 1, 2, or your scope 3, there's a bit more leniency in what data is available. So it is preferable that you be using farm level data. So if you own the farm, that is, then you should be looking for actual farm level data. So liters of diesel, type of tillage, the kilograms of fertilizers used, that sort of thing. While scope 3, there are a lot more options, and because this is developing, because we are at an early stage, there's a lot of pressure to try and get better data, but spend-based data can be the fallback at this time. but preferably purchasing data. So, in the textile industry, you'd be looking at kg of cotton or leather. If you were kind of buying oats, then maybe you'd be looking at tonnage of oats purchased, that side of things. And this is where we need to be engaging with our value chains, because to get a better understanding, it's the same with your wider footprint. You need to be engaging with your value chain. If you are purchasing a product, you need to be engaging with the person growing or making that product, and vice versa, to be able to understand it fully. And as mentioned, on the removal side, it is very much farm level data. You cannot be using kind of assumptions within this area. It needs very much to be actual primary data from the farm, ongoing, traceable, and with a kind of monitoring system in process. So to account for removals, you need to be using farm level data. Perfect. Okay, so I think there are some more questions coming in. We will be answering them shortly. So we've given an overview of what is accounted for, what type of emissions we're looking at, and what type of activities. So let's think about targets. So you've now calculated your footprint, you've worked through that. So what are the different things that criteria that the SBTi asks you to set your target? The boundary and target timeframe are very much linked to the non-flag targets. So for scope 1 and 2, it's 95% boundary, scope 3, 67%. When we're looking at a longer term, it's 95% for scope 1 and 2 and 90% for scope 3. And the target timeframes are very similar as well. So your near term will be, you will have a target date of between the next 5 to 10 years, while the long-term targets, we are being pushed to set a long-term net zero target by 2050 or earlier. The ambitions that we're talking about here are this is where they slightly differ. So for near-term targets, we would be looking for a 3 to 4% reduction per year going forward. So that is aligned to the 1.5 degree scenario, and that is going to be what's required. Well, actually, when we look at long-term targets, it's very interesting that FLAG accounts for a 72% absolute reduction by your target date for scope 1 and 2. And then for scope 3, it is a 72% reduction or 97% intensity reduction by the target date. And the reason for this is the SBTi and the GHG Land Sector Protocol understand, and they realize that these are natural processes, these are natural emissions in a lot of cases, and we are not going to be able to reduce all of those. So we can be doing a lot of things better and a lot of things differently. Regenerative farming, for example, and looking after our soils. But that does not negate that a lot of the processes are natural. So we will not be able to achieve the 90% reduction that the non-flag targets ask for. There are some wider ambitions, so there are kind of wider pathways for some commodities, but as per the latest guidance from the SBTi, these are still being developed, so they should be monitored going forward. But this is kind of currently just the wide sector approach that we're discussing here, because it is just not developed. It's not there yet, but it needs to be monitored. One additional commitment that we're talking about when you're setting an SBTi target for FLAG is it requires organizations to set a net zero deforestation commitment. And I've got a slide on that in the next slide to kind of dive into what that means and what the impacts are to wider companies. So, and again, just to kind of reaffirm the exclusions, things that you are not allowed within your emissions and removals of your FLAG target are carbon offsets and credits, avoided emissions, so based on product or material use, such as alternatives being used rather than a fossil fuel, for example. Product carbon storage, so bio-based products, you can't be accounting for that currently within this. And then technological removals as well. So we're only focusing on kind of the biogenic processes. And an interesting one is bioenergy. So bioenergy, and I appreciate it is a small NB down the bottom, but bioenergy, because of the far reaches that it is used and the way that it is used by a lot of fuels and included within a lot of fuels, and there is separate guidance on that. The SBTi have said that this needs to be accounted outside of your FLAG inventory and your FLAG target. So this is kind of accounted for separately. And this is largely focusing on, the bioenergy, biofuels, biodiesel, that sort of thing. So that's just something, a nuance to work with as you're looking through your inventory. Perfect. If we look at the next one, so what do these zero deforestation commitments look like and how do they work? So this is not a target, it is a commitment at the moment. Companies setting FLAG targets need to publicly commit to this zero deforestation, covering all scopes of emissions. Reducing emissions from deforestation is one of the highest priorities here. The SBTi also recommend that companies set no conversion and no peak burning targets across their value chain. And so while this is a recommendation, if you were to look further forward at what is developing, the SBTs for nature, this is going to become a requirement within that framework. So that's something to be aware of. But within SBTi FLAG targets, which is what we are talking about today, this is a recommendation and not a requirement, only the deforestation. And looking at the guidance that is currently out there on how to set these kind of commitments, what wording to use, the SBTi highly recommend that we look at the Accountability Framework Initiative, or also known as the AFI guidance. And this gives companies a very good way of working out how to monitor deforestation within your value chain, how to assess it, how to calculate it, and also kind of how to report whether you are achieving it or not. So I would very highly recommend looking up that framework. And how does that commitment look? Looks at company X commits to no deforestation across its primary deforestation linked commodities with a target date of no later than December 31st, 2025. And so primary deforestation linked commodities, this is where companies should be looking at the supply chain, looking at what they create or purchase and what is linked. So, think timber, think soy, and think palm oil, but there are also a lot. It depends on the kind of company that is setting one of these targets. So that was a very quick look at what FLAG targets are, and I think it's going to be fun to dive into the questions shortly. But let's bring that back to a summary. And Arnaud, Mireille, if you've got any thoughts to add, please do. But I think we're in a consensus that while the GHG protocol land sector guidance is not fully out yet, we're still in the draft form. The version 1 of the SBTi FLAG guidance is out, and so start now. What we're seeing from clients, what we're seeing from the wider community is that data is king, and we need to find it. So that is the next point. So start now, start collecting that data, start looking at what is available, where are your impacts, where are they within the value chain, what can you kind of impact now, and what can you impact kind of further forward. Set a target. So the SBTi have the guidance out. It is there, it is available. Look at setting a target to try and know where you need to be. And once you've got that, you can then kind of work out how you're going to get there. And over time, the same with your non-FLAG emissions, it's going to be a learning process of what emissions you've got and getting better data going forward. But you need that target to work towards. This is a very important one, and this is engaged with the with your value chain. So you need to be engaging with your suppliers, with your customers, with your clients. You need to be looking at who can provide data, who has data, and without an interlinked approach, you will not be able to reduce either your scope 3 emissions upstream or downstream. So just focusing on your own scope 1 and 2 will only get you so far. Your scope 3 emissions need to be a collaborative effort. So engage now. And finally, the last recommendation is explore the potential for eligible removal projects. You know, there's a lot of conversation around project development, but if you are working in a space, you're going to know it better than anyone else. And the eligibility of those removal projects is going to be key to achieving FLAG targets. As mentioned, the reduction kind of pathway is 72% for a long-term SBT. But you need to be looking at how you can kind of impact that through removal projects within your value chain for your FLAG emissions. And you need to explore that now. Waiting till a later date, in the same way as dealing with offsetting projects, you need to start now, just to kind of get them established, because it does take time. Perfect. Okay, so I appreciate that that's been a very long, very quick overview. I'll hand over to Murray to do some questions, and I'm looking forward to getting stuck in.
Sure. Thank you so much, everyone, for sending your questions. So I believe some of them were addressed throughout the presentation, but and Arnaud has been an incredible job trying to answer most of them as they come in. But there are a few elements in common questions that I've seen through in the chat. And I don't know who would like to take this, but the first question is, if we set FLAG targets before the finalized GHG protocol guidance is issued in 2024, will we have to review them after this is issued?
I'm happy to take this one. Yes, so the guidance from the SBT is that you should go ahead and set it now. But as you have quite rightly mentioned, the GHG protocol will be coming out in 2024. The guidance is that set it now, and then they can be reviewed at a later date if there are any large kind of changes to that. But yeah, that should not stop companies from setting them now.
Yeah, because it's quite common it's quite common that the guidance are updated. So yeah, it's better to begin, even if the final version is not there. It's the same for the SBTi. They used to update the guidance quite a lot. So at some point, it's time to go and to update it when the new guidance are coming.
And related also to the GHG protocol. Sorry, Arnaud.
Go ahead. Sorry.
There is a similar question. How do you recommend calculating FLAG GHG emissions, given that the protocol for land sector guidance is not finalized yet?
So yeah, I can take this one. In fact, what we do when we do a GHG inventory, basically we mainly use emission factors. And in fact, even before the release of the GHG protocol guidance, biogenic emissions and, for example, land use change emissions linked to enteric fermentation, etc., have already been included in most of the emission factors that we are using. It's not always the case. It's not always perfect. You maybe don't have the perfect models that are used, but usually the emission factors come from LCA, life cycle analysis, that have been made specifically for a product, and usually these FLAG emissions are included in the emission factors. So you can, even if you don't have the last version of the GHG protocol, you already have, in fact, FLAG emissions in your GHG inventory, even if it's not highlighted in some way.
Thank you. So next question, how do you go about working out the land use change in our supply chain?
I'll let you take that, Arnaud, seeing as you've been working on the recent tool.
Yeah, so to calculate your emissions linked to land use change, so first First thing is that you can go first using emission factors only, because that's the first part that you have to do. In emission factors, in some databases of emission factors, you will have your land use change that is included as an average, for example, of a country or of a region. Of course, it's just an average, but still, it's at least you include them. And then you need to go deeper at some point. So at least if these emissions are important, you need to go deeper. So you will have to collect primary data at some point. So this means that you will have to find what is the actual land use changes that are happening in the land where you are when you are collecting your agricultural or forestry raw materials. So of course, this is quite hard, but it's quite, in fact, the same issue as removals when you need primary data. And in fact, at some point for the whole flag inventory, you need to go deeper. You need to improve traceability, because if we only use averages, it will be hard to follow the actual evolutions of emissions. So it will be hard to make like a precise follow-up, an accurate follow-up of your SBTi targets. So basically what we recommend is going for a basic GHG inventory, flag inventory, using emission factors first, and then from year to year, little by little, improving your traceability and trying to get primary data, either for land use change emissions or for any land management emissions, and for removals in the same time. And as Sander told about, for example, we have a partner that provides a tool to make carbon footprint at farm level, which helps you calculate these biogenic emissions mainly more precisely through models. And some tools also use remote sensing. So it's basically using satellite data to collect your data more quickly. So it's something that can help you if it's very hard for you to collect data. If you know at least where the field is, where the farms are, you can use satellite data to collect data linked, for example, for land use change, and a few type of emissions linked to land management can also be calculated through satellites.
And Arnaud, follow-up question regarding emission factors. There are a few questions about where to find emission factors, which ones are the best ones to be used in databases, etc.
Well, as you said, you have a lot of emission factor databases first, and a lot of them are covering agricultural products. So, but some of them are most renowned, are better because they have a long experience. They are made by quite experienced consultancies or just experienced organizations that basically are specialized in LCA. So for example, in EcoAct, we recommend, for example, using AgriFootprint from Blanc, which are expert in LCA in the agri-food sectors. You also have the World Full LCA database of Quantis, which is quite a good one. The most used one in not only in the flag sectors is EcoInvent. That is also quite a very useful one, because it's broader. So you can use only EcoInvent, for example, to make a full flag and non-flag inventory. And then you have others, but I mentioned these ones that are, I think, the most important ones.
So, another question, maybe this is for you, Xander. So are flag SBTs and SBTs completely different from one another, and do SBTs solely focus on flag? I believe this is, what is the difference between a regular SBT and an SBT flag?
Yep, sure. So yes, they are separate. There are separate guidance. So previously, the SBT kind of set the parameters out for targets, and that is kind of following the generally the GHG protocol corporate guide, and that is kind of your usual emissions. The FLAG guidance has come out alongside the GHG land sector guidance, and so this is trying to account for even more emissions that were being potentially missed in that previous version. Earlier on, we showed that if you've got your inventory and if you've done your full calculation, you have split your inventory down the middle. You have your non-flag, so that's your non-flag emissions, and you have your flag emissions. Moving forward, you would then have a non-flag target, so a normal SBT target, and a flag target going forward. And if you look at the SBTi website, so you would have two separate targets for the near term, but when you start looking for long-term net zero, all of these emissions can be broken down and included within that net zero target. So I'd recommend you looking at that SBTi target tool. So yeah, just to confirm, those targets are different. You would have an SBT target for non-flag emissions. You would have an SBT flag target for your flag emissions, and then that would kind of work going forward.
And maybe just a comment on this, that the targets for non-flag, the non-flag targets will be more let's say difficult to attain than the flag targets, because the percentage of reduction of non-flag targets is more important than the percentage of reduction of flag targets. So the first point. And second point, as you can use removals in your flag targets, it's also easier because you have more options to decarbonize your flag emissions.
Mm-hmm.
And a follow-up question to that, in terms of the base year, so does a flag emission target need to have the same baseline as non-flag target?
I could take this one. No. So while the SBT guidance is to kind of try and link that up, I think we're all very aware that if you are calculating your flag footprint for the first time, it's going to be very difficult going back to when your base year was. So a lot of companies or organizations have 2019, for example, as a base year. Then if you're calculating your flag footprint now, you could set your flag footprint baseline as 2023. So to confirm, you can have different baseline years. It is better to link them up, but if that is not possible, that is fine.
Now, next question related to removals and carbon credits. Is it possible for agro companies that manage and grow crops, fruit trees, for example, to sell carbon credits?
I'll take that one. This is a very big question, and it's rapidly developing as we speak. I'm going to caveat it with in the first instance, you need to be making sure that you are measuring your footprint and your flag emissions before you start thinking about carbon credits. Make sure that you have got your emissions inventory calculated and down. But looking through the guidance, while it is kind of flip-flopping and it is kind of rapidly developing, the short answer is potentially. So essentially, what you should be looking at there is developing projects, and if you are doing it to the correct methodology, you potentially can sell those credits, but you need to be sure that you are not going to need those removals yourself. So it needs to be accounted for within your inventory, that you've got this many emissions. You can net off your removals from that. If you sell those offset credits to another organization, to a third party, then those removals cannot be accounted within your inventory or the inventory of anyone else within your value chain. So that's where the concept of insetting comes in, where there is the potential for encouragement in various ways from within your value chain to engage in these kind of processes and actually engage in these removal projects to ensure you're reducing and removing emissions within your value chain rather than selling them off to a third party. It is developing. The concept of insetting is ill-defined at best. So it's something to be aware of. I would just recommend calculating your flag emissions first and focusing on that. And two, just being sure that you want to kind of get rid of any of those benefits of the removals from your own inventory.
There is another question related to accounting of removals. How would removals be accounted for if the organization is selling removals as offsets?
How would they be accounted for? So if they are selling the emissions as offsets, then that basically means that you cannot count those removals within your value chain. They are not to be double counted. They need to be kind of put on another registry. It is completely separate and it needs to be avoided. So do not double count. You would then lose the benefit of including those removals within your value chain.
There are a couple of questions related to mining. So it says, what about land use changes related to mining?
So yeah, I could take this one. All emissions linked to any type of land use change has to be included in your FLAG inventory. So of course, mining can be one of them. If you deforest a zone to put a mine to extract things, you will have land use changes emissions related, and you will have to account them in your FLAG inventory. So there's no specific thing about mining. It's just when you go from one land use to another, these at any time entails emissions if it's in the wrong way, let's say this way, and you have to account for them in your FLAG inventory.
And to kind of add on to that, the actual emissions from the mining itself, that is a separate endeavor. So we'd be focusing at the land use change here. So how has that changed kind of on the land? The actual emissions from the mine itself are a separate thing and not necessarily part of your FLAG inventory.
Another question related to removals. Can you use removals in your own operations if your FLAG emissions are in your scope 3?
So just to make sure that I get that correctly. So the FLAG emissions are in scope 3, and then you've got your removals within your value chain, or kind of within your own operations in scope 1 and 2. I think that's tricky. It's going to depend on how that removal is being kind of developed and whether it actually counts within your operations. But if it is within your FLAG target, then you should be able to utilize that and kind of account for it kind of going forward. Arno, I don't know whether you've got any additions to that.
I can add on this. So in fact, removals, you will have two types of removals, scope 1 and scope 3 removals. So if you have removals in the field, in the farms that you are managing, you can account for these removals in your scope 1 as you account for the emissions linked to the farm in your FLAG scope 1 inventory. And if you have removals that happens in the field where you are collecting your agricultural raw material, you will have to account these. You can account for these removals in your scope 3 inventory, basically. So it's definitely linked to emissions. Like if you have scope 1 emissions, FLAG emissions, you will have scope 1 FLAG removals, and scope 3 emissions linked to purchased products, for example. You will also have removals linked to these purchased products.
Another question, does FLAG emission reductions will help us reach SBTi classic targets?
No, so if you are kind of calculating reductions within your FLAG emissions, that will be part of your FLAG target. So they are separate. So any reductions accounted for within your FLAG inventory will be for your FLAG target. Any reductions will be within your SBTi non-FLAG target will be accounted there. There will be some, depending on the invention, depending on the processes, there will be kind of some of that which is linked, but they will need to be split and accounted for in separate targets.
Another question, can we set a FLAG supplier engagement target?
it's not an option that is provided by the SBTi. So as compared to the classic SBTi targets, you cannot for flag targets. It's only either, we didn't speak of that, but it's either absolute or intensity targets that you have. So you have absolute target for any type of raw material, and you have intensity targets for a few commodities that has been listed, I think, in one of the slides.
We still have 5 minutes, so probably time for another question. Another related to carbon removals. Do carbon removal projects, self-owned, that qualify to offset your inventory under the FLAG SBT need to be registry validated? I guess this is referring to if those projects have been certified.
Yeah, so the guidance currently is obviously developing within the GHG protocol, land sector guidance, and so we're kind of waiting to see how that looks when it comes out. The current way it is looking is that no, they don't need to be kind of, you know, validated and verified in the same way that an offsetting project does, but they still need to kind of account for all the different other parts, so ongoing monitoring, traceability, permanence, all those kind of areas. I think the recommendation that we would give would be to account for those removals projects in the same way, so to the stringent degree that offsetting project methodologies also account for it, all the way up for it. So if there's a change going forward, you are not falling short. So basically, I would follow those wider methodologies to the letter as best as possible, but you would not need to necessarily certify or verify them at the end. But if you can verify the data, then that's always a positive.
I found another interesting question that I may take this, is how our biogenic emissions need to be included. If I'm correct, IPCC considers them carbon neutral, so they are excluded. So when the IPCC considers some emissions as carbon neutral biogenic emissions, they only speak of CO2 emissions that is linked to the use of bioenergy, because these CO2 emissions are considered as balanced with the CO2 absorption, sequestration by the plants through photosynthesis. But this is only a small part, well, a part of biogenic emissions. For example, you also have CH4 and N2O biogenic emissions that are linked to the combustion of bioenergy. These needs to be included in your FLAG inventory. And you also have a lot of other biogenic emissions, such as I mentioned before, CH4 emissions from enteric fermentation, or N2O emissions from mineral fertilizer use. And these emissions need also to be included in your FLAG inventory.
Excellent. So we are approaching the end of the webinar. We will try to answer to the rest of the questions after the session. We will publish a blog where we will share the recording and the slide deck of today. So please keep an eye on that. We will share the link as soon as it is out. Thank you so much, everyone. Webinar. Hope to hear from you soon, and thank you, Sander and Orna, for sharing your expertise today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mireille.
Okay.
Thank you, Sander.
Thank you, everyone.